Welcome to another episode of the Capital Playbook. My name is Charles Williams. I am the managing member and owner of Pioneer Realty Capital. Today we have a wonderful subject that we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about short-term rentals, the Airbnb business. And we have a young entrepreneur, a person who's really making some moves in the Airbnb or short-term rental business. We're going to get a lot of insight from him on that business and that business model and how it could work for you as well. But before we get into our discussion today, we always have that housekeeping to do. So we want to talk about the fact that you can support this show by liking it, by sharing it, and subscribing. So please take the time to do that. That allows us to attract guests, to bring wonderful content to you, and you can gain knowledge about some of these business models that we discuss, how we finance these things, and how it can have an impact on your career. But now with all of that being said, why don't we now introduce our guest, Mr. Derbigny, a young man who's owns Simple Short-Term Rental Management. That's a lot of words.
It's a lot of words, yes, sir.
Yeah. But Derek, thank you so much for being on our show.
Thank you for having me.
We've been trying to get you for some time. Now, you are a young entrepreneur. You own several businesses, but you found this niche in the short-term rental business.
Yes, sir.
How did you end up getting into this business?
So as you mentioned, being an entrepreneur comes with being opportunistic.
Okay.
Right? So when something presents itself that makes sense, you do your due diligence on it, and then you test it out.
Right.
So for me, my test was as bootstrapped as it gets. I literally, I found out about the Airbnb model after, traveling and staying in Airbnbs and figuring out there's a lot of profit to be made,
right,
on short-term rentals, especially if you have the property yourself.
Right.
So I took my own apartment that I lived in. It was just me, single man at the time, and I put it on Airbnb just for a week, just to see what would happen. I didn't know if I was going to get any bookings. I didn't really know what would come of it.
Right.
Within about 10 minutes of my posting, the entire week that I had posted was booked.
Wow.
And at that point, I was like, okay, well, if that happened in 10 minutes, I think that proves that's proof of concept right there. So from there, I began to save my coins through my other investments and other strategies. And the first opportunity that I got to get back to the short-term rental space, I did. And that was about 2.5 years ago.
Right.
And I've been growing ever since.
Wow, that's amazing. So that first week, the revenue that you were able to make, what percentage of your rental expense did that cover?
That first week actually covered my entire rent for the month. That 1 week. Well,
that's pretty good proof of concept. And so from there, you started your short-term rental business, and you've been growing from there.
Yes, sir. So I know what a lot of the listeners are probably interested in, because you hear a lot about is the arbitrage model, right?
Right.
That's where I got my start, but that's not necessarily where the long-term value is, of course.
Okay.
So basically, my model was to find these different complexes, your Class B, your Class C units that are still in desirable areas,
right?
And say, hey, if you're having trouble, leasing out some of your units, let's say you've got 10, 12, 15 units that have just been sitting 3, 6, 12 months.
Right.
I'll take multiple of them off of your hands, but in return, I want to be able to, rent them out short term. You will get a whole lot of no's in that, but when you find people that find the value in, or just in, such a circumstance where they have to get those units leased out, that's where you make your money. So what I've done is essentially use the arbitrage model to fund the purchases. So that way, I'm not necessarily paying for anything out of my pocket when it's time to actually buy the homes, buy the condos, buy your duplex. So that has been the easiest way for me, and I think is probably the easiest way for many people in the different markets around the U.S. to get into real estate. So utilizing those cash flows, utilizing that increased profit margin from the short-term rentals, and then finding those complexes that you can prove the value, hey, I can take those units off your hands. I'll make sure that they're in good shape. That's where you can then take that revenue and apply it to your own purchases, so that you're not coming out of pocket for any of it.
Okay,
that's where the real value lies, of course.
Well, that seems very interesting. So now the model you spelled out seems simple, but as you have gone into this industry, what are some of the challenges that you have experienced that you ultimately had to overcome to make your business model successful?
Absolutely. So we'll speak to the arbitrage side of it first. The hardest part of that model is actually getting the units, of course, right? So you have to build a platform where you can convince these complexes that you know, one, what you're doing, two, that it's worth the risk, and then three, that their units are going to be taken care of. I think one of the misconceptions of the short-term rental space in general is that short-term rentals are more risky because you have so many people coming out, in and out. What I've found is the exact opposite, actually, because for these short-term rentals to be successful, whatever you post on those pictures for the listing, it has to look like that and feel like that every single time. Whereas if you have a long-term tenant, once that year, 2 years, 3 years is up, you have no idea what that property is going to look like when it's done. And it's also far more difficult to get a long-term tenant out should they be doing something wrong. Like you have to go through the entire eviction process, XYZ. Whereas with the short-term rental platforms, if something's going wrong, if they're breaking the rules, I can get them out immediately, no questions asked. The Airbnb, VRBO, whatever have you, will back you on that. And then if anything goes wrong, they actually will cover anything that happens. So if a tenant breaks your TV, if they break the bed, which happens a lot, really.
Interesting.
That's a conversation in itself.
Okay.
Airbnb.
We'll put that on our nighttime show.
Right, there we go. Airbnb funds all of that. And we haven't had a single instance where we said, hey, this is what happened, here's the documentation, here's how much it cost, where they didn't cover it.
That is interesting. That's an interesting concept. And sometimes when you dig into an opportunity, you get this probably unrealistic expectation that one thing is true when really the opposite may be true. But it makes sense because as an owner of apartments, if I have a space that I know is constantly being updated, maintained in order to attract new guests, that's actually of greater value to me than opposed to having a long-term tenant that really doesn't have an interest because I'm not going to really inspect or view their space until the end of that lease, and there's no telling what I may get.
Exactly.
And so once you go in and you have that conversation with building owners, what percentage of them typically get it? Because I don't think all of them really get it and understand
I would say if you make 100 calls and actually get to sit down with 10 of them, 1 to 2 of them will actually understand. But that also comes back to having the platform, having the understanding, being able to communicate that you know what you're talking about and that you can execute on what you're talking about, right? Because if you just go in and you say, hey, I want to rent some spaces from you, it's very different than, hey, this is my company, this is what we do, this is what we've done, this is our track record, this is the expectation versus reality. Then you have a much better presentation and a much more, higher likelihood of getting those agreements.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's one of the challenges that you've had to deal with. What's another?
So another would be on the actual just platform side. So regardless of how you acquire the unit, whether you own it or whether you're, subleasing it, one of the biggest challenges is maintaining the expectations and managing the expectations of your guests. Because yes, this is real estate, but it's also, if not more, on the hospitality side of things.
Exactly.
So people are looking for an experience when they come. And whatever they see in those images, they envision their experience in the space. So it's kind of up to you to almost be a mind reader, if you will, and give them the experience that they envision without knowing what it is that they actually see in the space each and every time, right? So if you have a family of, like, let's take, the Orlando market, for instance. Those units are typically catered towards large families that are traveling to go to the theme parks. So they're envisioning, this experience with the family at home, comfortable environment. We can cook in the kitchen so we don't have to go out because the theme park tickets are so expensive. We can't afford to go out every night. Like, those are the types of things that you have to figure out. What are people predominantly using my unit for? And then being able to cater that and cultivate that every single time. And when you can pull that off effectively and make sure that, going back to what we said, that the unit is exactly what it was in the photos and what it was that was explained, then you have no problems. But that is very difficult to do. Yeah.
So now with your Airbnb units, are you targeting a specific clientele? For instance, I know of some owners of Airbnbs and that are active in that business model. They'll try to find units that are next to a hospital because they want to attract nurses that are doing the traveling nurse thing. What about you? Is it do you have a specific target as you develop your Airbnb platform or your portfolio, or are you just kind of catering to a large number of different types of guests?
So what we've done is we've basically created an algorithm that puts together all the data that we can collect from the Dallas metro to figure out why people are traveling here, and then targeted the majority of that market, right? So there's a large portion of people that we exclude, which would be if you're coming here to party, if you're here to, use the space for an event, anything like that. We don't allow any of that on the platform. It's just not worth the risk. Even with, Airbnb being as great as it is, it's just not worth the risk, especially when there's so many other people trying to travel here for the right reasons. Not that partying is the wrong reason. It's just not what we want our space used for.
Well, partying in your space is the wrong reason.
Exactly. Right? Exactly. Yes, not in our space. So if there's another host that wants to allow that, that's cool. Just not us.
Not you.
Yes, sir. So what we have found is we do have a lot of travel nurses that utilize the space, but they typically want longer stays. Right. So our units are catered towards shorter term stays because that is the most profit. So
gotcha.
A good Airbnb tip here is a sweet spot for flips, as they're known. So how many times you have to turn the unit over a month is anywhere from 8 to 12.
Okay.
That is where you get your maximum profit. So the long term of the short term, if you will, so a month, 2 months, 3 months, while those are still wildly profitable, especially when you compare them to your traditional long-term rental value, you still make far more money on the more stays you can get
8 to 10 times,
Right, 8 to 10, anywhere. Right, 10 is that sweet spot. It really is, especially if you have cleaners on staff, because that allows you to actually make money off of the cleaning fees versus shelling out, for each cleaning to a second or third party company.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's interesting. So the second challenge that you mentioned would be making sure that I forgot what
just
it is.
Meeting those expectations.
Meeting expectations. Right. Okay. So now you mentioned the cleaning and maintaining and really just kind of policing the space. Making sure that the tenant conforms to the rules. And you and I have had this conversation before. You have a very interesting approach to that. How does that work for you?
So for us, we have, we lay the rules out. The rules are posted in the home. You get the rules when you go to book. You also get them after you book. So it's very clear. We make it plain as day. You got 3 to 4 different chances to read the rules before you get there. Right. Then we have cameras at each unit just to make sure, not in, only outside. You can't put anything inside. Right. Only outside, just to make sure that, hey, if you said you're going to have 3 people show up. Not 12 cars pulling up to the unit. Again, going back to making sure that the space is being used appropriately. When it comes to the actual turnover and management of the units, we have the cleaning crew on staff. So that allows us to essentially cut our cleaning costs by a third. So your typical, if you were going to use a third-party cleaner, it would be anywhere from $100 to $150, every time you had to get the unit turned over. Right. At that price, you can't get to that 8 to 12 flip per month mark, right? Not without cutting significantly into your profits. So once you get to the scale to have multiple units where you can have someone on staff, now your cleaning fee, which is a typical cleaning fee for Airbnb, is anywhere from like $80 to $120, depending on the size of the home, of course. If you can pay someone, $30 to $40 to do the flip, and you've still got that typical cleaning charge, now you're actually making a profit on the flips themselves. And then that's when it becomes, far more beneficial to actually have as many people in and out of the unit as possible. Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. Now, so since these are short-term rentals and you compared it to being in the hospitality business, do you have any exposure to room tax like a typical hotel would have? Yes, sir. So that is actually market dependent. Okay. It depends on which city you're in. So to speak to the Dallas area specifically, that we do pay the hotel occupancy tax, the HOT, and that's a 7.5% tax. And the platform actually administers it. Okay, so they're collecting and then they're paying for you. Correct. So it's not anything that we have to do administratively. It just comes off the top and we never see it. Okay. So do you think that the most cost-effective way of being in the Airbnb business is to have the arbitrage model, or to go out and buy the unit yourself and then rent that out? What do you think that I can see distinct advantages from both sides, but what's your view on that? The most cost-effective way, if you have the capital up front, is definitely to purchase the unit, of course. Okay. Because one, your mortgage is going to be a lot cheaper in almost all instances, right? Makes sense. Than it would be for the rental agreement. Also, it also depends on what your agreement is with the owners of the, let's say the complex, for instance, right? If you have to get 10 units, that could potentially be, the down payment for a home. Right. Or let's say they want you to pay for all 3, let's say you get 2 to 3 units, but they want you to pay 3 months up front. Or they want to do a 10% split on the income, whatever it may be. Wow. All of those things are possibilities, right, that could actually end up you could spend the same amount that you would have had you just purchased the home yourself.
Right.
So it's definitely more cost effective to do it that way. It's just not the easiest if you don't have, a lump sum of cash to be able to put down.
Okay. So in some of those structures where you go in to rent the place, some of them will actually take a 10% split of your earnings?
Yes. So there's I mean, I've heard agreements where they do 50-50 splits
Really?
But they'll get, 50 to 100 units. And at that point, it could very well be worth it depending on the location of the units.
50% split, you're doing all the work on the hospitality side, and they get a 50% split.
Right.
Plus they get the rent.
Right.
Wow.
But in the same breath, you had no units otherwise, right? So that's not a good deal. Don't get me wrong. That's not something that we would go for.
Yeah.
But I've heard of those different things from different people.
Right,
yes.
right.
Yeah. So all of ours, we haven't had to do any splits. And I think that boils down to, being able to present that we know what's going on from the beginning and show the value in having those units and having them maintained properly.
Right.
I think if you can do that well, you don't have to worry about any type of splits.
Interesting. As you have gone in and created these agreements with some of the owners of these apartments, have you seen an opportunity where you've been able to grow the relationship where they now want to partner with you for you to rent more of their stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, yesterday, one of our longest, running partners in this, they said that they had to evict a few people, and they were like, "Hey, before we put these out, do you want to just go ahead and take them?"
Really?
And I was like, "Absolutely, yes."
Wow.
So they see the value in it now,
right?
Because they don't have to worry about it. They don't have to manage the unit. If anything goes wrong, they know that we're going to facilitate the vast majority of it. So they have no problem.
Yeah, and what's interesting as I see it from an apartment owner's perspective, turning units into an Airbnb really means you're getting into the hospitality business,
right?
And they may have expertise in owning and managing apartments, but maybe not on the hospitality side. And so when you're partnering with them, you're helping them convert some of their units into basically hospitality units, which may yield them a bigger return. Now, in general, when you go in and negotiate a deal with the owners of these units, are they charging you a premium to rent those units? Or because you're renting so many, are you getting a discount? How does that typically work?
So I've had instances where we get a discount because we're getting multiple units, and then I have some instances where we pay the typical rent, but we pay the first 3 months up front. But no, we've never had an instance where they charge us a premium, and I still think that comes back to them not necessarily understanding just how profitable Airbnb is.
Right.
And then some of them do, and they still have that barrier to entry that you just mentioned, where they're like, hey, I know how to manage apartments, but I don't know anything about the hospitality side of things, right? Because we don't want it to crash and burn, and then now we're back in the same place, and we got to figure out how to get these rented traditionally again. So no, we haven't had any premiums, but that also could be because we have a well-established platform and present it professionally. Yeah. So it goes back to treating it like a business, right? Anything that you treat like a side hustle will be treated like a side hustle. Right. So present it as a business, present it as the professional, organized, well-managed organization that it is, and you should be fine.
Okay. So as you look out into this industry, the Airbnb industry, what are some of the challenges you see that as an industry perhaps you guys are facing, and what are some of the opportunities that you think exist in the future for folks that basically are creating this the new hospitality model is what I call it. Instead of owning a hotel, instead of owning the building, you have this hospitality platform where you manage all of these units, and you're kind of in the hotel business, but it's distributed. Right. But what are some of the challenges you see, regulatory or just in general? And then what are some of those opportunities you see?
For sure. So to speak to the challenges really come in with, and I actually just spoke, well, not just a few months back, I spoke in front of the Dallas City Council because, or you may or may not be aware, but Dallas right now is weighing regulation on Airbnb because there currently is zero, right? There needs to be some regulation. Right. Like anything that is unregulated can run wild, and that's where your problems come from. Right. So going back to party houses, things like that, that's not what the platform is designed for. Mm-hmm. And that's where you get those issues where you have neighbors complaining about Airbnb being bad. You have neighbors complaining about short-term rentals were a problem. There's trash, there's all these cars on the street. Like that's not what it's designed for. Mm. So I think that is a challenge of actually fostering the proper regulation in these different cities, and it is up to the different municipalities as to how they go about it. But I think fostering the proper regulation so that you don't have misuse of these short-term rental homes, that they're being used for stays, people that are traveling, people that are here for business, whatever, what have you, that aren't going to be disruptive to the neighbors. So I think that is one of the big challenges. You also have the challenge of the hotel industry now getting into the short-term rental space, right? Because they are the original short-term rental, but they don't provide the same level of service at home. They don't provide the same level of service, hospitality, and they don't give you as much, right? You don't typically get a washer dryer. You don't typically get a full kitchen. You don't typically have backyard, balcony, whatever, what have you, that you get by having a home in the location. And I think a lot of it too, people feel like they're more a part of the location that they're in when they're in someone else's home, right? This is how they live in Dallas. This is how they live in New York. This is how they live in whatever country, right? So I think that is one of the challenges, but also one of the benefits. And then to speak to the opportunity, big aspirations here. My ultimate goal is to own multiple complexes that are basically mixed use, right? So think of a development where on the first floor, you've got anything that anyone that was traveling could need. So you've got, some popular restaurants, you've got small convenience store for anything that they may have left. And then the actual units, you have a split, between long-term renters and then between, the other half or whatever, run the numbers, of course, to make sure it's profitable. But set it up so that there is a mixed use development. So you have the short-term renters and you have the long-term renters. And I think that is one of the most profitable ways to go moving forward. And we've even, pulled some different things off the market just to run some numbers as to what that split would look like and what the profit would look like. Thinking ahead, nowhere near there yet. But I think that's one of the best ways to go. Kind of building a boutique hotel chain, utilizing the short-term rental platforms.
Yeah, and that concept is a proven model, because I know that there was a time when I would travel to New York often, and I would stay in Jersey, just across the Hudson River from Manhattan, and we would stay in a building that was predominantly short-term rentals. And on the bottom floor, they had everything. It was really nice. We thoroughly enjoyed being there. We had good parking, whereas at a hotel, we couldn't hardly get parking. We had everything we needed on the first floor. But in our apartment, it felt like home. There was a nice 2-bedroom apartment with a view overlooking the Hudson River. It was really a wonderful experience. So I had the conveniences being a guest of a hospitality suite, but I felt like I was at home. Right. And it sounds like that's kind of what you're looking for as well. Yes,
sir. Curating that goes a very long way.
Yeah.
And then let's speak to the profitability of the
Airbnb
we paid
a lot.
As well, right? Exactly.
Right.
So typically what we've seen, and again, everything that we do is based off of an algorithm that we built. And Airbnb is open source, so you can pull all of the data from every single stay in any city.
Wow.
Right? So we basically have taken an aggregate of all of that data, and that's where these numbers come from. But on your typical 3-bedroom home, when you compare to what you would get as a long, let's say you rented it out long term. Typically, you see anywhere from 100 to 140% profit margins on top of what you would make if you had rented it out long term.
Wow!
And that's with minimal numbers, right? So the profit margin that's quoted at is at like 66% occupancy, whereas we typically see 92% occupancy and that's our average over the last 2 years.
Wow!
So usually, we profit anywhere from $2,000 to $3,500 a month per unit. So there's a lot of money to be made in the Airbnb world, and I do think it provides a service not only for those involved, but for people traveling here. I really truly think that it is a benefit to the cities that allow Airbnb.
Okay, well, very good. Yeah, I definitely see the value and see the advantage, especially if you created that. You've taken care of the operating business side.
Right.
And that's the service industry, hospitality industry, where you're able to provide it. If you are a absentee owner or a passive investor, it probably doesn't work, because you got to have the service side to make the whole business work.
Exactly.
And what we have found that not everyone who gets into that Airbnb business is able to attain the same level of success, perhaps, that you have attained. Yeah. So now, if someone were looking to get into the Airbnb business, what advice would you give them? What would you say that the top 3 or 4 things they would want to be aware of before entering into a business like this?
Absolutely. The first thing, of course, is as cliche as it sounds, is to do your research.
Yeah.
Right? So you need to figure out your city. Mm-hmm. Where are people looking to travel to? That is the very first thing that you need to consider. So while you think it may be a great location, it may not necessarily be a desirable one for travelers. So figure out, when people are coming here, where are they looking to stay and why? Then try to cultivate an experience that matches the reasons that people are traveling to that area. So that would be number 2, right? Going back to that experience, that hospitality feel. If you're here for the Texas Rodeo, if let's say that's something that people are consistently coming here for, make the home feel like it's a part of that. Right?
Yeah.
So that stuff goes a very long way. I would say that the third thing is to make sure that you have your cleaning crew, whether it be yourself, someone on staff, or a third party situation. Make sure that that is on point and that they are there every single time.
Wow.
If there's ever a time where the cleaning isn't done or it's not done properly and you don't catch it beforehand, you will have issues. And it does not take more than 1 or 2 bad reviews to really tank a listing.
Wow.
So making sure that that's on point is key. And that's where, a company like Simple Short-Term Rental Management comes in. Mm-hmm. If you didn't have, the ability to be able to handle that stuff yourself.
And that's interesting, because not only do you have your Airbnb platform, you also have the management, which is a separate company that not only takes care of your Airbnb businesses, but it also handles the cleaning and so forth for other Airbnb owners as well.
Yes, sir. Okay. And one of the big values there, too, is that once we have it set up, there are a lot of different real estate agencies in the area that are looking to get into it that don't know how to, or just don't want to spend the mental bandwidth to get it done, but they recognize the profit in it. So they reach out to us, and then we facilitate that on almost like a white label basis, where we are that short-term rental branch of their company without necessarily being, brought to the forefront. So that's another interesting opportunity. You don't necessarily have to own these units in order to be able to get into the real estate business if you can manage them well. But I would say it would be difficult to get something started in that capacity if you hadn't had some experience, running some type of Airbnbs, of course, in the past.
Okay, well, good. So any other advice for people getting in? Because I kind of cut you off.
No worries. I would say that the next piece of advice would be to purchase them if you can.
Okay.
That's absolutely, because that's where your long-term value is, right? So let's say you go through the arbitrage model and you use that revenue to purchase a home. Then you develop a successful track record of that unit, a profitable track record. Now you've changed the cap rate, theoretically, of this home, where you can now turn around and sell it almost as a business instead of selling it as a home, because not only has the value increased, not only has it appreciated, not only have you made your upgrades as you needed to make it more Airbnb friendly, but now it is a cash flow generating entity in itself. So you can actually sell that for a much higher value than what you could otherwise.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I can see the capital markets shifting to accommodate that business model. In fact, we just got a new loan program this week where we can provide 90 to 100% financing on Airbnb units. Up to $2 million. So keep that in mind. If you're looking to get into the Airbnb business and you're looking to put a deal together, we have a product that now that target the Airbnb business model and providing that capital for Airbnb business owners. And we haven't talked about that yet. Now, I can see you're interested.
Absolutely.
But the capital markets are certainly responding to what they see as a successful business model in that short-term rental industry.
Right. And that actually brings up a challenge that I ran into when it comes to getting financing.
Right.
Most companies don't necessarily recognize Airbnb revenue as rent. So they utilize what they expect as a long-term rent versus what you would be making, which can significantly impact the amount of money that you can get for a deal.
It impacts the value, it impacts the underwriting, impacts all that. Yeah. So, I've always said that, if the deal makes sense, there's capital for it. And generally, the traditional sources of capital, and I call them traditional. They're really not, because banks are very confined in what they can do. But that's where everyone runs to, is the bank, where they don't give you a lot of options.
No.
But we have this vast world called the capital markets, where you have all types of capital groups that provide capital for very specific reasons. And this Airbnb space is now becoming more popular because anyone who puts their capital out, there are two things they want. Number one, they want to know they're going to get it back. That's number one. Second, they want to get it back, and they want that capital to have some babies. They want to make a profit on that dollar. And you can show a model that's sustainable and consistently generates a return to a capital provider, you're going to get a deal. Because that's why they have the money. Their whole job and their whole reason is to put that money to work and to generate a return on that money. And there are so many debt funds. There are so many equity funds. There are so many pockets of money that are competing to find deals that are going to generate a return so that they can take care of their investors that they serve. And certainly we're not a stranger to that because we do the same thing. So yeah, there are some new products that are coming, and I think you'll find that beneficial.
Okay, so let's throw a question to you in regards to that. So
I'm being interviewed now.
Here we go. Just one. So what would a deal look? What would you be looking to get in return? Like, what would you be looking to see from an Airbnb manager, owner, operator in order to fund a deal for the next steps? Like, what type of data would you be looking to see?
So and that's a very good question, because of the fact we recognize in the product that we're representing, recognize that this is more of a hospitality, product or project than it is a short-term or a rental property. So the way you underwrite and evaluate rental property would be different in the way that you analyze and evaluate hospitality. So we're going to look at it as it's hospitality. We're going to look at your RevPAR, your revenue per unit. We're going to look at your occupancy. We're going to look at the market data that we're able to aggregate from some of these platforms to show what the average occupancy is in the market and if that unit is conforming to that. And so our underwriting is more similar to hospitality than it is to doing an apartment building or anything like that. And I think that's what makes it work, because we look at the right metrics to determine if that deal makes sense and if it's going to generate the return that we need to ultimately pay back our loan.
Got it. Yep. That's the same data that we look at. So that's interesting.
Right. Yeah. So, but I tell you what, it's been very interesting having you on the show. I've always wanted to, we talked about you being on the show before. This Airbnb model, this short-term rental model is becoming so popular. In fact, there are institutions that are creating funds just for doing this short-term rental business. And that tells you how popular it is. But it's an opportunity for you, if you can structure the deal properly, make the right connections, provide that level of service and hospitality, then I think you can be as successful as this young man here, Mr. Derbigny.
Hey, I'm trying.
Yeah.
Getting started, but we got a long way to go.
Well, thank you so much for being on our show, and love to have you come back and talk about your future success.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So make sure you like, make sure you share, and make sure you subscribe. You are what makes this show great. Thank you again for being a part of it, and we look forward to seeing you next time.